Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really digging into something huge. The last, 30 years of U.S. foreign policy towards Russia?
That's right. And our sources, they make a pretty bold claim. They argued this policy didn't just fail to keep America on top globally. It actually ended up being the main driver behind a massive shift in the whole world order.
Wow. Okay. So not just ineffective, but counterproductive on a grand scale.
That's the core argument, yeah. The policies enacted, driven by these doctrines demanding absolute supremacy, they didn't secure that unipolar moment everyone talked about.
It's dead.
Instead, they unintentionally sort of sped up the rise of a different world, a multipolar one focused on Eurasia, with Russia and China at its center.
Okay, let's rewind a bit. To understand that, we have to grasp the American mindset right after the Soviet Union collapsed in '91.
Definitely.
Our sources talk about this powerful belief in American exceptionalism, right? And it was tied up with that Francis Fukuyama idea.
The end of history.
Exactly, the end of history. The feeling that liberal democracy had basically won, game over for other systems.
And that mindset, that conviction, it directly shaped the strategy that followed. Which brings us straight to the Wolfowitz Doctrine.
Named for Paul Wolfowitz. This was in the '92 Defense Planning Guidance.
That's the one. And the goal was stunningly clear, almost, hubristic.
Which was?
To prevent any other nation from rising up to challenge the U.S. economically or militarily, full stop.
Any nation. So, not just adversaries, but potentially anyone.
Pretty much. The U.S. would actively work to stop rivals emerging, even maybe friendly ones if they got too strong. A strategy of perpetual hegemony, really.
Okay, perpetual hegemony. But who was driving this? Was it a consensus view or more of a specific group pushing this very aggressive stance?
Well, it was definitely pushed hard by certain influential circles. The sources point quite directly at neoconservative thinkers, and they were working very closely with the military industry. People like Robert Kagan, for instance. He explicitly named Russia and China as the biggest challenges to liberalism.
Not partners then, but fundamental challenges.
Exactly. And these weren't just abstract ideas debated in journals.
No, they formed groups to push this, right?
Yeah.
Like think tanks.
Precisely. You had organizations like the Project for the New American Century, PNA.
Right, PNA.
They were openly calling for huge increases in military spending and, crucially, for challenging regimes the U.S. didn't like. They specifically mentioned Iraq, Syria, Iran.
So this is becoming concrete policy, not just theory.
Very concrete. And here's where it gets really quite chilling. Remember General Wesley Clark, former NATO commander?
Yes, I do.
He spoke back in 2008 about what he termed a policy coup right after 9/11. Said, hard-nosed people took control.
A policy coup. What did he mean?
He revealed, apparently, a classified plan to attack and basically destroy 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq.
And ending with Iran. I remember reading that. It's an absolutely astonishing claim of, predetermined conflict.
It is, and that level of continuity, that persistent militarism, it points to maybe a deeper structural issue. Something Professor Michael J. Glennon called the power of the Trumanite institutions.
Trumanite institutions.
Yeah, basically the entrenched interests, the military, the security agencies, intelligence services. The idea is they effectively run national security policy, kind of separate from the elected officials, the Madisonian institutions.
So a permanent government driving security policy regardless of who's elected.
That's the implication. It helps explain this consistent push towards militarism that, President Eisenhower actually warned about way back in '61.
The military-industrial complex warning.
Exactly. And adding another layer, you had Zbigniew Brzezinski, not a neocon, but influential. His book, The Grand Chessboard, it laid out a geopolitical strategy focused squarely on Russia.
What was his approach?
Basically, militarily intimidate Russia, weaken it economically, and reduce it to just being a resource provider for the West, particularly for energy.
Wow. Okay, so that's the framework for confrontation.
Yeah.
And looking at the timeline, it seems like this developed into a clear strategy with 3 main parts: military, economic, and informational pressure.
Yeah, a 3-pronged approach, which Russia claims has been aimed at them ever since.
Let's break that down, starting with the military dimension, maybe the most contentious part. NATO expansion.
Right. This is absolutely central. For Russia, the core issue goes back to what they see as a broken promise, this disputed, uncodified accord.
In not 1 inch eastward assurance.
Exactly. The Russian side insists that when they agreed to let Germany reunify, they got assurances from the U.S., from Secretary Baker to Gorbachev, that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. Now, it wasn't a formal treaty.
But they argue the understanding is clear.
They do. And the historical record is, well, debated, but the Russians certainly believe it was a firm commitment.
And it wasn't just the Russians who were worried about breaking that understanding, was it? There were some very prominent American voices raising alarm.
Oh, absolutely. Loud protests, really. George F. Kennan.
The architect of Cold War containment himself.
Right. In 1997, he called NATO expansion the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Pretty strong words.
Extremely strong. And he wasn't alone.
No. Even then, Senator Joe Biden, back in 97, he predicted that expanding NATO to the Baltic states would provoke a vigorous and hostile reaction from Moscow.
So the potential blowback was foreseen.
Clearly. But maybe the most direct and ultimately ignored warning came later, in 2008, from William J. Burns, who was ambassador to Russia at the time.
His famous "Nyet means yet" memo.
That's the one. Yet means yet, Russia's NATO enlargement red lines.
What was the specific warning about Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO?
Burns was blunt. He said bringing them in would engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability. He stressed that Russia genuinely perceived this as encirclement.
Which gets to the core of the red line issue for Russia regarding Ukraine, doesn't it?
It does. Geographically, Ukraine stretches very close to Moscow, only about 450 miles. So the idea of NATO, a military alliance Russia sees as hostile, potentially placing missiles that could hit Moscow in minutes, that's seen in the Kremlin as an absolutely unacceptable existential threat.
And while NATO was moving east, something else was happening with strategic stability, right? The arms control treaties.
Yes, critical point. The U.S. started dismantling the very treaties that had been built up over decades during the Cold War to manage nuclear tensions.
Which ones specifically?
Well, the U.S. pulled out of the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, back in 2002. That was designed to prevent a defensive arms race fueling an offensive one.
Okay.
Then in 2019, the INF Treaty collapsed that governed intermediate-range missiles in Europe. And then the Open Skies Treaty, which allowed surveillance flights.
So pulling out of these agreements,
it sent a clear signal. Combined with deploying missile defense systems, especially in places like Poland and Romania, it just massively ramped up tensions. The sources argue this was partly intentional, forcing Russia into a costly arms race to strain its economy.
Okay, so military encirclement and dismantling arms control, that's the military pressure. What about the economic side? You said it was another prong of this strategy.
Absolutely. And again, the sources frame this as proactive U.S. pressure, with Russia often reacting.
What was the main economic goal regarding Russia?
A long-standing one, actually, to prevent any deep, meaningful economic partnership between Germany and Russia.
Why Germany specifically?
Because that combination, German industrial power and technology with Russian natural resources and, well, manpower, that was seen as a potential geopolitical bloc that could challenge U.S. influence in Eurasia.
George Friedman, the Stratfor analyst, was pretty blunt about it, wasn't he?
He was very candid.
Yeah.
Said that kind of Russian-German cooperation was the one thing the U.S. feared most and that it had to be nipped in the bud.
And this isn't a new policy goal either, right? It goes way back.
Oh, yeah. Think back to the Uruguay pipeline in the early 80s. Reagan slapped sanctions on it to try and stop it.
But European leaders pushed back then.
They did. Margaret Thatcher, the EEC, they fiercely resisted, arguing the sanctions were illegal under international law and bad for trade. It's quite a contrast to today, where our sources describe European leadership as being much more aligned with U.S. goals, almost like vassalage.
Which brings us to Nord Stream 2.
Exactly. The culmination of this economic pressure. You had very explicit threats from U.S. officials, President Biden, Victoria Nuland, saying they would end the pipeline one way or another.
And the sources connect this to the sabotage in 2022.
They strongly suggest the pipeline sabotage was almost certainly carried out by, or at least with the blessing of, the U.S. The goal, they argue, was to permanently sever that German-Russian energy link and lock Germany into supporting the economic war against Russia.
A pretty explosive claim.
It is.
But despite all this pressure, the massive sanctions package imposed after February 2022, It didn't collapse the Russian economy as predicted, did it? Why not?
Well, the shock and awe sanctions failed, basically because they were based on a flawed premise. Remember Senator McCain calling Russia a gas station masquerading as a country?
I do. That line got a lot of play.
It fundamentally underestimated Russia's resilience. Yes, its dollar GDP looks smaller, comparable maybe to Spain, but that's misleading.
Because of purchasing power parity.
Exactly, PKP. When you look at what the ruble actually buys inside Russia, their economy is much larger, more comparable to Germany's, around $4.4 trillion.
And they're self-sufficient in key areas.
Hugely self-sufficient.
Yeah.
Energy, food, metals, basic industry. They could weather the storm in a way many Western analysts didn't expect. In fact, the sanctions arguably backfired more on Europe.
How so?
We saw huge energy price spikes and real fears of deindustrialization, particularly in Germany, after losing that cheap Russian gas. Meanwhile, the Russian ruble, after an initial dip, actually ended 2022 as one of the world's strongest currencies. A real boomerang effect.
Okay, so military and economic pressure. Let's turn to the third prong, the informational dimension, and specifically how it relates to the conflict in Ukraine. The sources argue Ukraine was deliberately chosen as the battleground.
Yes, following that Brzezinski logic, Russia can't be a major Eurasian power without influence over Ukraine. So Ukraine became the focal point.
And the key event here is 2014.
The Maidan protests, definitely, which ended, as the sources describe it, in an American-orchestrated coup removing the president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was seen as too close to Moscow.
And we have Victoria Nuland's comments again.
Right. Her recorded phone call admitting the U.S. had invested $5 billion in Ukraine's, quote, democratic development over the years, and of course her infamous dismissal of the EU's concerns.
The fuck the EU line.
That one. It highlighted the U.S. driving the agenda there.
There were attempts at peace after 2014, though, like the Minsk agreements.
There were. But here's another key revelation from the sources. Years later, both Angela Merkel of Germany and François Hollande of France admitted something quite startling.
What was that?
They admitted they never really intended the Minsk agreements to bring lasting peace. They saw them primarily as a way to buy time for Ukraine to build up its military strength with Western help.
So diplomacy as a tactic to prepare for more conflict.
That's how the sources portray it. And they also point to the, let's say, awkward alliances during that period. U.S. officials like Vice President Biden, Senator McCain, they were seen meeting and even being photographed with leaders of Ukrainian ultranationalist groups like Pravi Sector and Svoboda, groups involved in the coup and the subsequent civil war in the Donbass.
Okay, so fast forward to February 2022. How do the sources frame Russia's decision to launch this special military operation?
They frame it as a response, essentially forced, to several factors. The massive buildup of NATO-trained Ukrainian forces near the Donbas republics, perceived threats to Crimea, and President Zelensky publicly musing about Ukraine potentially acquiring nuclear weapons again.
And there were peace talks early on in the conflict.
Yes, talks were held in Belarus and Turkey. But the sources claim these were effectively sabotaged, primarily by the U.S. and the U.K., who encouraged Ukraine to keep fighting instead of seeking a negotiated settlement.
Which leads us directly into the information war aspect.
Absolutely. The stated U.S. goal, articulated very clearly by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, was to see Russia weakened.
How is that pursued informationally?
Well, beyond the rhetoric, it involved direct, practical support, providing Ukraine with real-time intelligence for targeting, helping them use advanced weapons like HIMARS effectively, basically acting as a co-combatant in many ways.
And propaganda played a huge role, too, right?
Massive. The sources list several prominent examples that captured headlines but were later significantly questioned or debunked.
Such as this.
The Ghost of Kyiv fighter ace legend. The story of the martyred defenders of Snake Island, who, it turned out, had actually surrendered and were alive.
Right.
Then there were incidents like the missile strike on the Kramatorsk train station, initially blamed on Russia, but forensic analysis, according to the sources, showed it was a Tuchka-U missile, a type used by Ukraine, not the Russian Iskander.
And the incident in Poland.
Ah, yes, the Przewodo missile strike. Very tense moment. A missile killed 2 people in Poland, a NATO country. It was immediately blamed on Russia, triggering calls for NATO consultations. But it was later confirmed to be an errant Ukrainian S-300 air defense missile.
So a pattern of narrative shaping.
A very intense information environment central to how this conflict has been waged and perceived globally.
Okay, let's zoom back out. We've covered the military, economic, and informational pressure. What's the big picture outcome? According to the sources, the single biggest maybe ironic consequence of all this
is that the U.S. policy, designed to prevent rivals and maintain unipolarity, ended up doing the exact opposite.
How so?
It pushed Russia and China together. Decades of U.S. strategy aimed at keeping those two Eurasian giants divided. Well, that failed. Now you have, effectively, a strategic partnership between them, united largely by their opposition to U.S. policies.
Which brings us back to those classic geopolitical theories, doesn't it?
It really does. You have to think about Halford Mackinder and his heartland theory from over a century ago.
Remind us.
His idea was, who rules the heartland? Essentially, Eurasia commands the world island Eurasia plus Africa. Who rules the world island commands the world. U.S. strategy was always implicitly about preventing any single power or alliance from dominating that heartland.
And now?
Now, thanks in large part to policies meant to prevent it, that heartland is more strategically unified primarily through the Russia-China axis than ever before, a major unintended consequence.
And we're seeing the practical results of this shift now, with the rise of alternative global structures.
Absolutely. Look at BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's expanding, potentially bringing in major players like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, the UAE.
If that happens, BRICS becomes enormous.
Huge. It would represent well over half the world's population and a massive chunk of global GDP, especially in PPP terms, plus control over vast energy reserves. It's a clear alternative power center emerging.
And this directly threatens a cornerstone of U.S. power, right? The dollar.
Yes. The challenge to the U.S. dollar's global dominance is accelerating. This whole process is often called de-dollarization.
How is it happening?
We see Russia demanding rubles for gas, China using the yuan more for oil purchases. The key thing to watch is the petrodollar system, the old agreement where Saudi Arabia priced its oil exclusively in dollars.
That's been crucial for dollar demand globally.
Absolutely. Now, if the world's top oil producers, potentially Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, all possibly within an expanded BRICS framework, start trading significant amounts of oil and other currencies, that fundamentally undermines the dollar's global reserve status. It's a seismic shift.
A shift Putin himself declared, didn't he, back in June 2022?
He did. He stated quite plainly, the era of the unipolar world is over.
So to wrap up the core argument from our sources, this combination, the aggressive Wolfowitz Doctrine, the influence of neoconservatives focused on confrontation, and maybe a lack of careful statecraft.
It led the U.S. to unintentionally forge the very Eurasian counterblock, the very multipolar world it was trying so desperately to prevent. A strategic own goal, if you will.
Okay, so a final thought for our listeners to chew on, based on everything we've discussed.
Yeah, I think it's this. Consider the foreign policy approach described here, the heavy reliance on military solutions, the weaponization of trade with sanctions affecting, nearly a quarter of the world's population now. Compare that constant pressure and confrontation with, say, the more measured, albeit ideological, diplomacy of the original Cold War. Has this modern approach alienated huge parts of the world, especially the global South? And the big question, the one for you to really think about is, this shift away from a unipolar world towards multipolarity seems inevitable now. Could it have been managed differently, more peacefully, perhaps through genuine diplomacy and, maybe a bit more mutual respect, rather than the pursuit of absolute dominance? Something to ponder as global events continue to